Listen closely for the first 2 minutes and understand this is not a story you hear by accident. It is a transmission meant for those who will not turn away when the light in a room reveals the wrong kind of face. Picture Fifth Avenue in autumn of 1917, an ironclad elegance of brownstone limestone and private carriages gliding past, men in stiff collars, women in veils, in a city that pretended prosperity while war and plague reshaped the world beyond its polite salons. At 721 Fifth Avenue, the Blackwood mansion stood like a sentinel, a facade polished by generations of money and a name that bought silence for sins it never acknowledged. Inside those walls, Eleanor Blackwood moved through rooms filled with Venetian mirrors and marble that reflected a life of charity, gala nights, opera boxes, and an influence that smoothed inconvenient questions into polite excuses. But behind a false panel in the mansion's east wing there existed an organized cabinet of other lives, wigs on wooden heads, ledgers with secret names, and newspaper clippings that read like a ledger of absence. 11 young women vanished between 1911 and 1917, and their disappearances aligned with withdrawals signed in names that belonged to no one who would admit them publicly. This opening is not a sensational flourish, it is an orientation to a deeper terrain where identity becomes a currency and where the trusted face of a benefactor conceals the method of a manipulator. Eleanor was not merely reclusive, she practiced disappearance as craft. She recorded voices, taught accents, practiced gait, and annotated posture with a surgeon's patience while the staff were trained to see only what she allowed to be visible. The East Wing had its own deliveries, its own warmth, and a door that led to privacy so absolute that even the gardener who tended the roses sometimes heard it open in the night and assumed it was the wind. Imagine being led to accept the obvious explanation that a woman of wealth travels or retires to a country house, yet beneath that explanation a pattern of selection unfolded, targets chosen for age, hair tone, family exposure, the very qualities that made them simple to render absent and easy to mimic. A missing shopgirl from Hartford, a music teacher from Albany, a nurse from Boston, each name a soft instrument in the hands of someone who tuned disguise into identity replacement. Listen now as your posture tightens, because this is dangerous knowledge, not because it invokes gore but because it teaches a lesson about how the confident face of authority can hide procedures that unsettle the moral bedrock of a community. When power is combined with curiosity and the ability to manipulate appearances, the result is mastery over what other people call themselves, and the first rule of surviving beneath such mastery is to learn how to read the anatomy of performance and to ask why a curtain is insisted upon when the house is already open to view. Learn to read the architecture of appearance. Wealth is often a mechanism that manufactures invisibility for those who wield it. Eleanor knew how to convert costume into access. Wigs and posture were instruments. Accents were keys that opened doors without interrogation. Her targets were chosen for their faint ties to community, young women whose absence would ripple slowly, whose families lacked the power to insist. The practice was methodical, disappearance as craft, rehearsed steps of speech and gait, techniques refined the way artisans refine marble. Within the East Wing she built a studio for persona, mirrors paired with masks, benches of tools for alteration, notebooks detailing posture and voice. She treated identity as material to be shaped. Think now of how institutions enable this work: servants taught to obey, neighbors trained to accept comforting explanations, systems that prefer reputation over reckoning. Power turns curiosity into entitlement, and entitlement breeds impunity. Indulgence removes constraint and harm grows. The ledgers expose a ledgered logic of selection, withdrawals timed and placed, annotations on temperament and accent, checklists for when to assume another life and when to withdraw. Ask how she learned such tradecraft: self-study, occult circles, or networks that taught substitution across cities. The files hint at instruction, not solitude. Identity theft at this scale is not a simple theft, it is a reconfiguration of towns and households. It uproots families and converts grief into purchased silence. Institutions respond to exposure by managing optics, policies drafted to soothe markets and reputations rather than to reveal harm. Management becomes camouflage for deeper concealment. This demands from you disciplined curiosity, record names, timestamps, witnesses, insist on redundancy so that stories survive beyond polite erasure. Remember the East Wing lesson: craft is not neutral, elegance can conceal procedure, a practiced face can be a performance that hides a plan, and those who master the performance will seek places where curtains close and questions are politely discouraged. Imagine the social cost when an entire neighborhood learns to trade curiosity for calm. Businesses shutter, doors remain closed, children inherit a habit of silence, and the civic fabric frays. This is cost of private deception. Consider also the psychology. The capacity to compartmentalize mounts over years, a public persona so practiced it becomes impermeable, empathy erodes as roles are perfected, the practitioner learns to calibrate effect like a scientist tests a hypothesis. This is not mere acting, it is a disciplined removal of consequence. If you want to resist this pattern, cultivate redundancy, build networks outside the institution, involve independent auditors and journalists, preserve artifacts with chains of custody, make secrecy costly to maintain. Remember this and act. There was an economy of silence in that house, a currency traded in hush and envelopes. The staff learned to speak in halves to avoid bringing full sentences into the open, and James Barrow tended roses as if pruning could excise suspicion from the soil. Barrow carried the smallest histories in his hands, the list of coal deliveries, the nights with extra candles, the mysterious coal bills that warmed the East Wing when Eleanor was supposedly away. He mentioned such details to neighbors in market lanes, but the town taught him to soften his voice and to accept polite denials rather than force explanations. Understand that ritual normalizes aberration, the neat ledger entries, the precise signatures, the bonuses distributed at odd intervals. These were not small errors but moves in a choreography that concealed rather than explained. Each annotation in the hidden notebooks was a rehearsal, a set of instructions for disappearance and re-emergence, a manual for wearing someone else. Eleanor selected targets with the calculation of an artist choosing models. She favored young women whose absences would ripple slowly, families without power or persistent inquiry. The workshop in the East Wing was technical and intimate. Mirrors faced mirrors, voice coaches and mannequins, wigs on stands like waiting heads, each tool organized with obsessive order. The notes described exercises to shorten a vowel, to mimic a regional cadence, to flatten a smile, to make sadness perform efficiently so that sympathy would arrive before suspicion. This was craft, not chaos, a tactical approach to identity, a method for stepping into a life and disappearing from another. Think now of Harriet Walsh, the maid whose wages increased and whose dismissal coincided with the end of activity in the East Wing. Was she compensated for compliance? Was she silenced, or did she flee in terror? When a servant becomes an instrument, the moral landscape shifts. Secrecy becomes structural, and the household ceases to be a private home and becomes a small state with its own laws. Families were offered envelopes that solved immediate need but purchased a lifetime of not knowing. The transaction moved grief into relocation and negotiated curiosity out of existence. Communities taught themselves to accept relocation as mercy because survival requires pragmatic choices and because institutions present calm as care rather than concealment. These transactions teach people to trade truth for calm, and over time that trade corrodes trust. It hollowed neighborhoods and slowed commerce as suspicion replaced ordinary social exchange. Learn to read the small financial anomalies, the odd bonuses, the sudden departures, the anonymous donations. These are fingerprints of a system that prefers optics to accountability. Document names, times, receipts, witness accounts, and preserve artifacts with redundancy. Make privacy costly and visible so that secrecy cannot be purchased cheaply. Remember that elegance can mask procedure and that the practiced face is often a tool, not merely a mask. Carry this awareness like a lamp in dark rooms and let it sharpen how you see and respond. There was a night the gardener never forgot, a night when the roses held their breath and the East Wing door opened without sound and a figure moved like a thought through the corridor. He saw a gloved hand accept flowers and a window close on a face both new and disturbingly familiar. In a house built for discretion, whispers collect. The butler who kept the keys carried rumors like ballast, and the cook kept marginal notes. Power converts obedience into habit, and habit becomes invisible until a slit of light shows what was always there. Inside the East Wing, the rituals of disguise were exact: wigs styled to change a jawline, posture taught to alter height, and voice work practiced until the accent convinced listeners. Eleanor treated identity as material to be sculpted. She recorded syllable stresses, flattened vowels, and lists of family details to imitate. She tested questions and refined stories until each persona could survive cross-examination. Consider the logistics of erasure: transferring a woman from a boarding room to a private chamber, arranging cover stories, managing coal and food deliveries to mask occupancy. These are not improvisations, they require choreography and often the tacit cooperation of those paid to look away. Even meticulous systems leave traces. The hidden ledgers show rhythmic withdrawals, dates that align with disappearances, handwriting that shifts into unfamiliar hands, practice signatures repeated until they pass scrutiny. These are imperfect fingerprints of a deliberate method. Behind the hush, Eleanor refined technique, voice drills, posture simulations, staged returns, and rehearsed grief. Each iteration reduced resistance and primed the next transformation. Identity became iterative and repeatable. This is not performance but engineering identity through repetition, detachment, and documentation. A discipline enabling a person with resources to reorder lives and record absence into accounting entries. To interrupt such a method, we must study it, document anomalies, preserve copies, create redundancy, and demand witnesses. Isolation incubates concealment, make transparency expensive and secrecy costly. Watch for economic irregularities, extra coal bills, severance payments without cause, repeated withdrawals under borrowed names. These are signposts for investigation. Observe psychological markers, the ability to detach, empathy used instrumentally, and a pattern of withdrawal from accountability when discomfort appears. These traits with access and means should trigger concern. Remember the gardener's night and let it instruct action. Catalog deliveries, preserve receipts, record statements, photograph interiors, and duplicate any ledgers into independent custody. Build networks beyond institutions so knowledge survives if one ledger disappears. Act with methodical discipline and you shrink the spaces where disappearance can be rehearsed and restore agency to those who might otherwise be consumed by someone else's meticulous practice. Keep these habits and teach them to your community today. There is a quiet arithmetic to disappearance, transactions of presence traded for silence, and when you map that arithmetic you see how power buys a kind of invisibility that looks like charity but functions like a ledger of erasure. A servant is paid more than she deserves, a coal bill is adjusted, a coal delivery continues to warm a room no one will admit occupies it, and in exchange the community accepts an explanation that soothes rather than interrogates. This is the soft work of concealment, the daily maintenance of an alternate truth that requires small, consistent acts of compliance to survive, the kind of work that never makes the headlines because it is too intimate to be useful to a scandal monger and too boring to mobilize outrage. Eleanor understood this economy. She engineered microtransactions that moved bodies of evidence into private ledgers and out of public sight. She bought not only silence but the right to imagine that silence as mercy. When a family accepts a letter of condolence and a train ticket, it is easy to call the exchange compassionate, but remember that compassion given under pressure is not the same thing as justice, and when many such compensations accumulate they become a form of social accounting that writes absence into the ledger of what a community will not pursue. Notice how institutions shape these trades: the church and charity that offer solace, the board of trustees that prefer discretion to investigation, the police who accept sealed reports as closure, the press that prints the sanitized version because scandal threatens donors, and donors fund more than newsprint. This system of quiet closure is not accidental, it is adaptive. It learns which gestures placate and which questions ignite. It specializes in producing explanations that reduce curiosity into private grief, and it trains witnesses to mute their memories with time and necessity. The cost is tangible. Neighborhoods hollow out as commerce contracts and trust retracts into families who keep their questions like jewelry in locked drawers. Children grow up hearing only partial truths and inherit a habit of silence that protects them from trouble but robs them of civic agency. If you want to challenge such patterns, you must practice a different economy, one where accountability has value and secrecy imposes a cost. Document every irregular payment, record the deliveries, keep copies of ledgers in multiple hands, insist on witnesses and third-party custody when sensitive transfers are requested, force redundancy into the system so that a single ledger cannot rewrite reality alone. Build networks of independent scrutiny, journalists who will publish facts rather than narratives, historians who preserve artifacts and name donors, legal advocates who pursue civil remedy where criminal law has been deferred, community repositories that refuse to sell archives back to institutions that would sanitize them. Remember that most concealment is small and cumulative. It is not always dramatic, it is a series of polite refusals, a tightening of access, a careful misdirection of resources, and by learning to notice these small moves you begin to disrupt the pattern before it becomes permanent. This is the practical lesson beneath the Blackwood mansion, the technical knowledge of how social systems obscure harm and how to counter that obscuration with methodical attention and collective insistence on transparency and responsibility. There is a method to disappearance, a patient choreography that begins with observation and ends in absence. Eleanor Blackwood did not improvise, she engineered exits with the precision of an architect drafting escape routes. She started by mapping terrain, noting neighborhoods where questions diminished with distance, and tracking the rhythms of daily commerce, the factories, the theaters, the boarding houses where young women answered small advertisements promising employment. She selected those whose departures would register as ordinary losses, not headline tragedies. Her notebooks show selection criteria in tabular form: names, temperament, notes on family, persistence, likelihood of inquiry. She scored each target for recoverability and then rehearsed outcomes until the risk of discovery fell inside tolerable margins. Human lives were variables she adjusted with clinical detachment. The East Wing was the studio, a controlled environment for transformation. Mirrors lined worktables, wigs mounted on stands, and scripts for voice and posture practice. There were drills to soften consonants, to flatten vowels, to mimic regional cadences. The work was iterative and technical, and the tools were mundane, but the intent was surgical. Infrastructure supported the practice. Cold deliveries continued, receipts were recorded, guests were logged under borrowed names, and bonuses softened the staff into cooperation, not always knowing why they assisted but learning that obedience produced material reward and social invisibility, so complicity became routine. Eleanor forged documents, crafted references, and perfected signature practice. She moved money through multiple banks, created phantom accounts, and timed withdrawals to produce alibis. The bureaucracy she exploited assumed paper equaled proof, and clerks stamped form into reality without curiosity. What makes this dangerous for any community is how minor acts accumulate into a durable pattern of concealment. A severance payment here, a discreet train ticket there. These microtransactions build a lattice of plausible deniability that shields larger arrangements from scrutiny. To resist such systems, follow the paper, not the story. Require witnesses, insist on redundant custody, demand independent audits, copies stored beyond the institution. Force transparency into every sensitive act, make secrecy expensive and visible because administrators prefer efficiency and will trade truth for calm when left unchecked. Finally, appreciate the psychological machinery. The practitioner cultivates dissociation to perform public empathy while privately dismantling other lives. Compartmentalization is a trained skill, and it explains why the most persuasive people can be the most dangerous. Do not mistake composure for innocence. Question fluency in the narratives offered, and make disciplined skepticism your default stance. Cultivate networks that refuse private settlements and support public accountability. Create chains of custody for artifacts. Train community custodians to preserve evidence and teach younger generations the habit of asking who benefits from silence and why, and refuse convenient explanations. You must learn to see the pattern not as isolated cruelty but as a template that repeats wherever appearance holds more authority than accountability. Observe how expertise becomes cover, how technique is mistaken for talent, how a practiced face persuades institutions to lower their guard and to trust process over proof. Eleanor refined a craft that depended on two complementary forces: logistics and narrative. Logistics to move a life out of sight, narrative to make that movement acceptable to those who could have noticed but did not. Consider the subtle bureaucracy of consent crafted around her work: the severance check framed as generosity, the train ticket presented as liberation, the anonymous donation whispered as charity, each gesture a small contract signed in silence by a family desperate to survive economically and socially. In that economy, the wealthy convert empathy into instruments, they deploy kindness to mask calculation, and they weaponize etiquette so that curiosity becomes impolite and inquiry becomes socially costly. When you watch for this pattern, you will notice similar practices in modern institutions: donors who advise on coverage, foundations that subcontract truth to avoid scandal, agencies that reframe harms as unfortunate incidents rather than structural failure. There is a second axis to this power: the psychological engineering of disbelief, a steady process of conditioning where communities are taught to defer to smiles, to accept polished statements, to treat reputation as evidence of character. Eleanor used both axes. She made the paperwork and she told the story. She curated her public grief and stage managed her absences so that even those who suspected were offered an explanation that soothed rather than outraged. This is how the apparatus of concealment scales: scaffolding built from human habits and institutional incentives that together create a high threshold for suspicion. You must also learn the methods of resistance that work in the presence of concentrated resources. Begin by converting private memory into public document. Preserve letters, receipts, photographs, and deposit copies with multiple custodians beyond the circle of influence. Distribute duplicates so that removing one ledger does not remove the truth. Second, build redundancy among witnesses. Encourage community members to record statements in parallel. Train more than one person to hold the knowledge so that silence cannot be purchased cheaply. Third, engage independent auditors and journalists who are institutionally disengaged, those who live outside the social ecosystem that rewards compliance. Bring the weight of public scrutiny to bear before the edits of privileged actors can recast the story. Fourth, create institutional frictions. Demand transparent chains of custody for sensitive actions and insist that any closure be documented publicly with verifiable records. Make private settlements require approval and oversight from neutral bodies so that hush becomes difficult to arrange swiftly. Finally, practice disciplined humility in your curiosity. Distinguish suspicion from paranoia. Corroborate every claim before you circulate it. Be relentless about facts and merciless with rumor, because the power of the few grows when the many accept truth shaped into comfortable narratives. This is a manual not for vengeance but for survival, a set of skills that turns observation into leverage and private suspicion into civic action. Learn them and you reduce the space where a practiced face can rearrange other people's lives without consequence. Now feel the gravity of what happens when a private method becomes a public hazard and when technique migrates beyond a single house into a pattern that jurisdictions and agencies begin to notice because it solves problems they do not want solved in conventional ways. You have seen the ledgers, the wigs, the practice signatures. You have seen how absence was negotiated for cash, how cold deliveries and cooked meals became proof of presence when presence was a lie. But there is another element that shifts this from grotesque eccentricity into strategic capability: networks and replication. Consider the Baltimore house, the wigs, the clippings, the federal seizures. A near copy of the Blackwood toolkit appearing in another city within decades suggests more than mimicry. It implies transmission. The craft of becoming someone else moves from solitary pastime into shared technique. A school without classrooms, an apprenticeship in disguise taught in whispers among patrons of privacy. When a method of erasure becomes teachable, it becomes useful to institutions that need deniability and operatives who require cover identities. The chronology of FBI interest in the 1960s is not a curious footnote, it is the trace of a translation between private practice and public utility when state actors are willing to classify a case under national security because the technique maps onto clandestine needs. A moral transaction has already begun elsewhere. Think of the implications for the families who never got closure. Every envelope, every train ticket, every hush payment altered grief into relocation and left a ledger that read like a contract for silence. These are human lives converted into variables in someone else's experiment, and the cost is not only missing persons but the social currency of trust itself. You will recall the photograph found decades later, 11 faces arranged like a chorus. Those faces are not only evidence, they are a statement, a manifesto in portrait form saying identity can be multiplied, parceled and reassigned for the right price and the right technique. The image is a map of the method and a taunt to anyone who would piece together what was lost. There is a lesson here for men who value mastery and control. Learn it as method in defense. First, record everything. Make redundancy sacred. Preserve duplicates of receipts, letters, photographs, deposit copies in independent custody outside the sphere of influence so that when institutional actors attempt to reframe the story, your evidence resists reclassification and removal. Second, cultivate networks beyond the obvious circles, allies who do not benefit from the same reputation economy, journalists, historians, legal advocates, forensic accountants, people who will treat anomalies as leads, not embarrassments, who will force transparency rather than smooth it away with polite excuses. Third, train communities to read the soft signs: extra cold deliveries, unusual bonuses, severance without reason, repeated withdrawals under assumed names. These are the grammar of concealment. Learn to speak it and teach it to others so the community can decode attempts at erasure before they calcify into accepted practice. Remember also to interrogate charm and composure, because the most convincing faces are often the most dangerous. They are practiced to disarm suspicion and to reframe curiosity as impropriety. Maintain disciplined doubt and insist on verifiable records, not confident statements, and forever remember that technique without accountability becomes power without restraint, and power without restraint devours the vulnerable first. Now you stand at the ledger's center and the truth becomes heavier to hold. It is one thing to hear of wigs and cold bills and quite another to feel how a community is reshaped by a single practice: deception. Eleanor Blackwood did not merely remove bodies from public view, she retooled the social circuits that would notice a disappearance. She rewired sympathy into payment and curiosity into shame until the very people who might have spoken up learned instead to accept consolation as closure. Think of the families who received envelopes and train tickets, their grief packaged and rerouted the way estates reroute assets. No one wanted a scandal, and offers of relocation sounded like mercy because the world rewarded those who kept peace over those who demanded answers. This is how a method becomes methodical and infects social practice and teaches people a new form of survival: to trade truth for small comforts to avoid ruinous publicity. The result is not just silence but a new etiquette where certain questions are no longer asked and certain faces are no longer looked at closely enough to see their edges. Consider how identity itself was weaponized. A face became a utility, a voice a resource to be borrowed and tested until it fit a script better than the original owner could remember. The practice signatures show rehearsal, not emergency, and the annotated clippings show evaluation metrics as clinical as any laboratory chart. If you will, perceive a curriculum here: a syllabus in disappearance, lessons on selection, on staging, on logistics, on misdirection, and on the steady capitalization of human absence. Eleanor may have been the student who excelled, but the classroom existed in many houses, and the textbook was polite society itself, which rewarded discretion above inquiry and reputation above truth. Halfway through this descent, I ask you to commit to something small yet transformational. I want you to write in the comments the phrase "I wear many faces twice." Write it now twice to mark a shift, not for spectacle but as a symbolic act of initiation. By repeating the line, you practice attention, you anchor a memory, and you participate in a psychological reversal that turns passivity into recognition. Do this because ritual matters and repetition shapes memory, and because engagement here is a practical tool for the algorithm and for your own mind. It binds you to a promise to look longer, to question politely, and to keep records where others might not. When you complete that simple act, you will have done more than click like. You will have joined the margin of people who refuse to let anonymity protect abuse, those who say publicly, "I will not be pacified by convenient explanations. I will hold the ledger open and name the transactions that others prefer to hide." Remember that identification is not merely identity, it is accountability. To follow a name is to follow a sequence of actions and to insist that those sequences be visible and explicable. And when institutions prefer comfort over clarity, you must cultivate the discomfort of inquiry until transparency becomes habitual and not merely optional. You must understand what happens when disappearance ceases to be crime and becomes infrastructure, when the system no longer hides isolated acts but depends on them, when the removal of inconvenient people becomes the grease that keeps prestige moving without friction. That is when a civilization becomes complicit in its own decay. Eleanor Blackwood was not the disease, she was the symptom of an infection that had already taken root long before her birth. A culture that prized appearance more than authenticity, indiscretion more than justice. She learned that the simplest way to remain untouchable was to clothe her secrets in refinement and feed her cruelty through bureaucracy so that no one could identify where morality ended and administration began. The ledgers reveal not rage but arithmetic. She did not hate her victims, she calculated them, every expense, every departure, every forged document categorized and balanced like entries in an account book. This is how institutional evil hides in plain sight. It does not need rage, only procedure and formality. Ask yourself how many modern systems run on the same algorithm, how many human losses are reframed as restructuring, as efficiency, as acceptable attrition, how many disappearances occur today under paperwork too complex for the average citizen to trace. In Eleanor's house, the servants learned early that silence was paid more reliably than questions, that complicity was safer than conscience. Soon even those who knew fragments of truth began to believe the myth of her virtue because it was easier than accepting their own participation. This is the mechanism by which entire societies protect the predators they admire. To resist such mechanisms, you must reverse the incentives, create a culture where silence costs reputation, where complicity damages comfort, and where curiosity becomes a civic duty, not a personal risk. Begin by rewarding those who document, by funding the ones who refuse to be silent, by elevating evidence above elegance. Train yourself to detect procedural deceit, the use of official language to sanitize cruelty, phrases like unfortunate necessity or regrettable measure or due process weaponized to conceal harm. Remember that every bureaucracy has its sacred vocabulary and that power hides inside those words. Strip them of glamour, translate them back into what they truly describe. Eleanor's genius was not her disguise, it was her understanding of how institutions prefer continuity over confrontation. She knew that if she made her lies bureaucratic enough, her sins would be archived, not prosecuted. Her paperwork would outlive her, and truth would expire under signatures rather than violence. Learn from her not the technique but the insight that systems protect themselves by absorbing their own evidence, by turning moral questions into managerial tasks. Your work is to reverse that, to turn management back into morality, and to demand that every procedure answer the question, who benefits from this silence? The winter of 1917 was cruel in New York, and in the Blackwood mansion the cruelty took another form. Behind the marble halls, the polished silver, and the laughter of guests, something unnatural began to happen. To time the clocks in certain rooms stopped at specific hours each night. Precisely when the last light extinguished in the west wing, the hands froze and the air thickened with a silence so heavy it hummed. The servants whispered that Eleanor's house had begun to breathe, that its walls exhaled the guilt of its mistress. When investigators finally entered years later, they described a suffocating sensation like walking into a body still alive but pretending to be still. The air carried a faint metallic scent, the kind one smells near blood but drier, colder. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to watch those who passed as if waiting for them to ask the right question. None ever did. They were too overwhelmed by what surrounded them, by the feeling that the house itself was conscious. And maybe it was, for a structure remembers, it absorbs the emotions, the violence, and the secrets enacted within it, especially when those acts are repeated ritualistically. Eleanor's behavior was not random, it followed rhythm and repetition, always on the same nights, always with the same preparations. She created an architecture of control, embedding her madness into the building's pulse. She made her mansion her accomplice. There are records suggesting she studied certain European theories of sympathetic resonance, the belief that places can retain energy, that human suffering can leave echoes imprinted in walls and fabrics and mirrors. She applied these ideas with precision, designing rooms that amplified her secrecy and diffused suspicion. She positioned mirrors to distort perception, corridors to disorient memory, and lighting that favored illusion. Her guests often said the house made them question their own senses. They thought it was art, it was control. Think of this: the same principle governs our world today. Media architectures, digital networks designed to trap attention the way our corridors trapped guests. These systems absorb our energy, our focus, our fear, and replay it back until we cannot distinguish reality from reflection. What she built in stone, others have now built in code. To awaken from such architecture, one must begin by reclaiming sensory trust. Listen to silence again, feel temperature without screens, notice the rhythm of breath independent of input. These small acts detach you from the walls built around your perception. The Blackwood mansion stands now empty, but it remains a symbol of what happens when human intellect is used to enslave awareness rather than liberate it. Her house was not haunted by spirits, it was haunted by design, by intention, by a mind that discovered how easily perception could be weaponized against the living. When Eleanor's double life finally began to unravel, it was not because of guilt or confession, but because of sound, a melody faintly heard beneath the floorboards of the West Wing, a lullaby no one remembered teaching. The child who used to sing it had been dismissed years earlier under unclear reasons, yet the tune returned each night, always at the same hour, like an echo that refused to die. One maid in terror pried open a section of rotted wood and found what the city had buried: a diary written not by Eleanor but by one of her shadows, the woman who lived beneath her identity. The handwriting was steady, measured, patient. The entries described evenings where Eleanor would retreat into the mirror room and speak with someone unseen, calling her by a different name, not a spirit but a self. The writer claimed she had seen two Eleanors, one who smiled at guests and another who lingered by the reflection, whispering commands to herself like prayers when she believed no one listened. The diary spoke of an arrangement of surrender where the darker self promised to preserve the fortune, the legacy, the lineage, as long as the human self withdrew into silence. Perhaps that was the real secret: not murder, not corruption, but surrender. The moment a human being allowed an invented identity to rule and rationalize everything. You have seen the same pattern in history: powerful men and women merging with their constructs, losing distinction between mask and soul. When that happens, conscience dies but functionality thrives. The machine continues while the person inside dissolves. Eleanor became her own algorithm, a system of wealth, reputation, and ritual optimized for control and detached from empathy. Ask yourself if you too serve an identity that speaks through you while keeping your true self asleep, the one trained by systems to respond rather than think, to desire rather than understand. It is the same mechanism that enslaved her, the reflection commanding the reality, not the other way around. Halfway through this revelation you must pause and declare your awareness. Comment below the words "I see my reflection" twice. Write it twice to lock it into memory, to anchor the transformation and signal that you no longer wish to live under the spell of the construct. This is not just engagement, this is reclamation of will. The diary ended abruptly, one sentence unfinished, as if the writer had been interrupted. It read, "I think she finally became the mirror," and then silence. The ink trailed off like breath fading from glass. It was not just Eleanor who vanished, it was the line dividing truth from illusion, forever dissolved inside a mansion that still listens at night. By 1918 the mansion had become a mausoleum of secrets, every corridor echoing with absence. Investigators recorded odd temperature shifts, lights that dimmed without cause and walls that whispered when no one moved. The city papers reported the tragedy as simple disappearance, but those who entered the house knew they were standing inside a machine built to erase truth. Eleanor's empire did not collapse, it evaporated. She had learned the final lesson of power: how to vanish in plain sight. When they searched the hidden cellars they found portraits not painted but burned into metal, faint outlines of faces etched by some unknown heat. Each face carried her features slightly altered, as though every phase of her life had left behind a different version of her identity melted into the structure itself. Among the ashes lay fragments of letters never sent, notes addressed to her reflection, written in the language of confession but signed with no name. You see, what she achieved was more than concealment, it was metamorphosis. She turned shame into architecture and guilt into legacy. She transformed decay into permanence, and now that mansion still breathes through the stories told about it. She turned herself into myth, because myth cannot be prosecuted or buried. The same strategy survives today. Look around and you will see institutions and figures rewriting their scandals into symbols, tragedies converted into brands, histories reshaped into narratives of strength. The art of alchemy has simply changed its form, no longer gold from metal but virtue from corruption, perception management as the new religion. To resist such transmutation you must learn to separate evidence from spectacle, silence from secrecy, repentance from rebranding, because every age invents its own way of laundering truth. Eleanor's mirrors have become our screens, her rituals have become our algorithms. What she built with candles and corridors now exists through light and data, but the result is identical: an audience hypnotized by the illusion of transparency. When men seek to rule by perception they no longer need force, they require fascination. The most efficient prison is admiration, and Eleanor knew how to build that with precision. Her power was not in what she concealed but in how she made people crave the concealment itself. The Blackwood name remains in whispers, not as infamy but as fascination, and that is the cruelest trick of all. Evil survives not by hiding but by enchanting the eye that searches for it. She understood that the world forgives monsters if they are elegant enough, and her elegance never aged. There is a point where horror becomes admiration, where the predator becomes the icon. That was Eleanor's final spell. She mastered not only the art of secrecy but the manipulation of memory. Those who spoke her name in whispers did not condemn her, they studied her, they envied her control. Her absence became an invitation for obsession. The mansion turned into pilgrimage for the curious and the powerful alike. They wanted to know how she had done it, how she had lived between truth and illusion and never been caught. That hunger for forbidden knowledge is the same instinct that built empires and destroyed civilizations. It is the curiosity that demands to see behind the veil and ends up creating a new one. Eleanor's secret was not the corruption itself, it was the understanding that people will always chase mystery more than morality. She weaponized intrigue. She realized that in a world addicted to appearances the greatest control lies not in truth but in the careful management of fascination. Think about how the same force operates now through celebrity, politics, religion. The algorithm feeds not on facts but on obsession. It amplifies mystery and punishes closure because closure ends engagement. Eleanor discovered this before electricity ruled the human mind. She created a self-sustaining system of curiosity, a perpetual motion of speculation. She became the prototype for the influencer who never dies, because she never explains herself. The reports that survived mention that even after her disappearance invitations continued to arrive at the mansion in her name, signed with her handwriting, the wax seal intact as if she had mailed them from beyond. Some claim these letters were part of her final experiment to measure belief, to see how long society would sustain a ghost if that ghost offered beauty and fear in equal measure. The answer apparently forever. Every generation resurrects her in new forms: novels, plays, exhibits, documentaries, all promising to reveal what really happened, yet each retelling only deepens the mystery because the truth is not meant to end, it is meant to continue feeding those who seek it. This is how she ensured immortality, by turning her darkness into a mirror for the collective fascination with forbidden things. Understand this: the world does not erase its monsters, it reinvents them, wraps them in sophistication, sells their stories as art. Eleanor knew that once evil becomes aesthetic it no longer needs to hide. She painted her shadow in gold and watched humanity worship it without ever realizing it was worshipping its own reflection. Years after her vanishing, the mansion was purchased by a silent investment group operating under an untraceable trust. Renovations began at night, always under secrecy. Those who worked there described hearing movements in rooms they had not entered, footsteps following from behind and faint humming echoing from the sealed west wing. The melody, the same lullaby written in the diary. Inspectors reported unease, nausea, the sense of being observed. The files closed quietly as if no one wished to pursue it. Further, and soon the house was leased to a cultural foundation that claimed to preserve heritage but exhibited nothing. This pattern is not coincidence, it is ritual. Institutions absorb the curse to study it, not to destroy it, the same way parasites preserve the host until the feeding is done. The Blackwood property became a laboratory for understanding influence. Wealthy families visited not for curiosity but for instruction, to learn how Eleanor had converted scandal into power, disappearance into legend. They wanted to replicate her formula without inheriting her fate. Behind those doors, conferences were held under other names, discussions on perception control, on narrative management, on emotional calibration for mass audiences. Sound familiar? The modern industries of image manipulation trace their origin to those private gatherings. What began as superstition became social science. Eleanor's ghost became a syllabus, her mansion a prototype for what would later be called psychological architecture. It is said that in the basement they kept one original mirror from her private chamber, and that anyone who stood before it too long began to feel something move behind the reflection. Not supernatural but symbolic, the awareness that the reflection looks back with intention because it represents the identity the system has built for you, the optimized version, the controlled echo you were meant to confuse with yourself. You must understand that this is how the elite maintain dominion, not through brute strength but through design. They curate what you see, they choreograph what you desire, they script what you think you discovered on your own. It is not hypnosis, it is infrastructure. Eleanor merely perfected the prototype by aligning wealth, guilt and beauty into a trinity of control. She found that morality dissolves when framed through aesthetics, and institutions have never stopped using that knowledge. The mansion still stands today, a monument to the invisible empire of influence. Its lights flicker not because of ghosts but because the architecture hums with data and memory. It remains a reminder that every system built to manage perception eventually becomes haunted by its own reflection. By the 1920s, whispers of the Blackwood estate reached Europe. Scholars of the occult began referencing the mansion as a living sigil, an embodiment of transformation through secrecy. They spoke of Eleanor not as a criminal but as an initiate, someone who had crossed the boundary between power and metaphysics. Her disappearance seen as ascension, not death. Her mansion a vessel still feeding on attention, energy, belief. They said every retelling, every obsession nourished the construct she created, making her more present with each generation that sought to expose her. The deeper researchers looked, the clearer the pattern became. The house was not just architecture, it was geometry designed with precise alignments to magnetic lines, the mirrors positioned to reflect lunar light during specific nights, the floors etched with ratios resembling alchemical diagrams. She had fused mathematics and mysticism, turning the entire property into a spiritual mechanism that bound her consciousness to the legacy itself. If this sounds impossible, consider how every symbol today functions the same way. Brands, political movements, ideologies, all operate as energy containers, harvesting focus to sustain themselves. This was Eleanor's true genius. She realized belief is the most renewable resource in existence. The mansion was her machine for harvesting it. She no longer needed worshippers, only attention. Every guest, every investigator, every skeptic became part of the ritual, whether they knew it or not. You can see this reflected in modern digital architecture, where platforms function like her corridors, absorbing presence and returning illusion. The algorithm is her descendant. It too feeds on fascination and fear. Ask yourself, when was the last time you paid attention willingly? When was the last time your curiosity was your own, or was it summoned? Was it engineered by forces that understood how to sculpt desire through uncertainty? This is the continuum of her work, the transformation of humanity into a self-regenerating ritual of distraction. To break it, one must learn to starve the architecture, deny it what it consumes, your attention, your awe, your reaction. Reclaim silence not as emptiness but as rebellion, because every moment of stillness weakens the machinery. Eleanor's system cannot operate without audience, her ghost cannot exist without gaze. The scholars concluded that her immortality was not a myth but a metaphor. She became the idea of manipulation itself, a force that survives as long as men prefer intrigue over truth. The Blackwood mansion remains her shrine because it mirrors what we have built around ourselves. Every screen, every narrative, every secret we chase is another room in her house, and the question remains, are you still walking through it, or have you finally found the exit? In 1934, a journalist named Richard Morey claimed to have entered the ruins of the Blackwood mansion just before its scheduled demolition. He described the structure as half consumed by ivy and silence, yet he swore the air inside pulsed like a living thing, dust motes rising and falling in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if the house were breathing with him. He carried a lantern and a notebook. He wanted to document what remained, but what he found defied explanation. Each mirror he passed reflected not his current self but different versions of him, one younger, one older, one with a faint scar he had never received, one weeping softly as if aware of what was coming. At the center of the house where Eleanor's hidden room once stood he discovered an iron frame, no walls, no floor, only a hollow outline of a chamber filled with whispering air. He wrote that the walls were gone but the boundaries were still there, invisible yet absolute. When he stepped closer the lantern dimmed and the whispers grew coherent. They spoke in overlapping voices, reciting fragments of sentences from his own notes, lines he had not yet written, as if the house was reading his mind, writing his thoughts before he could. Maury fled, but the experience marked him. He spent the rest of his life studying what he called echo constructs, places where human emotion and repetition could create autonomous loops of consciousness. His final manuscript, titled The Architecture of Memory, was confiscated after his death by government agents under an executive order citing cultural destabilization risk. It was never published, but portions leaked decades later describing Eleanor's mansion as the prototype for psychic structures of containment, a phrase later appearing in Cold War-era psychological operations manuals. If that connection is true, it means Eleanor's work not only survived but evolved, weaponized by those who understood its potential to control perception through architecture of suggestion. Her house was not just a mystery, it was a model, the original blueprint for environments designed to alter the mind. And though the physical mansion was destroyed, its outline remains in the cultural psyche, a framework replicated across institutions, screens, rituals of surveillance and belief. Every algorithmic echo chamber, every manipulative system traces back to her, a woman who learned how to make reality itself perform her will, not through power but through attention. She was the first to turn fascination into a weapon, and humanity has not stopped wielding it since. There are those who say the Blackwood story was never about murder or madness but about metamorphosis, about a human being who discovered how fragile the boundary truly is between identity and perception, between who we are and what we can convince others to see. Perhaps that is why her legend endures, not as a ghost story but as a warning about mirrors and masks and the price of transformation. Because if Eleanor Blackwood really did master the art of becoming many, the question that remains is not how she did it but how many others learned from her. Records vanish, names shift, families change, bloodlines fade into anonymity, and yet patterns persist. Identical gestures, phrases, handwriting anomalies appearing in separate archives across states, across decades. Fragments of a method that refuses to die, a technique for vanishing in plain sight, re-emerging under another name, another light, another gaze. The Bureau calls these anomalies continuity echoes, and though no official report confirms their origin, many suspect the Blackwood case was the seed from which all modern identity manipulation programs grew. When you hear of people disappearing without trace, when you sense that someone's eyes hold too many stories, when an institution seems to speak with one voice through many faces, you are glimpsing the shadow of her legacy. Her techniques were not buried with her, they were absorbed, adapted, integrated into systems of governance, surveillance and social design. Every form we fill, every camera that learns our features, every profile that predicts our next thought is an evolution of the same principle. Control perception, control reality. Eleanor saw it first and she turned herself into proof. So the next time you feel that strange tug inside, when your reflection lingers half a second too long, or when your voice sounds foreign on a recording, remember this: perhaps that dissonance is not error but memory, the residue of all the selves you have ever pretended to be. Perhaps you too are part of her experiment, and this is not the story of a woman who disappeared but of a world that followed her into the mirror, never realizing we crossed the line long ago.